One of the best prospects in the 2023 NFL Draft has a warrant out for his arrest. So does that make things easier or more difficult for the Chicago Bears with the number 1 overall pick?
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. On the podcast today, we look at all of the fallout from Jalen Carter's, pending arrest as he returns to Georgia to deal with the misdemeanor charges he's facing in connection with a tragic incident he may have been loosely involved in at the very least. So we'll take a look at what exactly is going on with Carter and how this will affect his stock in the 2023 NFL Draft. We'll look at how it affects the Chicago Bears with that number 1 overall pick. Does it make it easier to trade down, or does it make it more difficult to trade down, and how it affects some of their plans in this draft, and what that means for Will Anderson as the top prospect perhaps in this draft, or how we feel about staying at 1 to get him as the clear-cut top guy now versus some of the other edge rusher options in this draft, and kind of compare and contrast the different flavors of pass rushers the Bears might be looking at with their first-round pick wherever they end up taking it. Now, the news came out, Wednesday morning at the NFL Scouting Combine. It was like 15-20 minutes before Jalen Carter was set to speak to the media. The report comes out from police down in Georgia. I don't know exactly how their system works, if it's the district attorney's office that issues warrants or the police. But regardless, an arrest warrant issued for defensive tackle Jalen Carter, seeking a couple of misdemeanor charges for his involvement in an incident that led to the death of another human being. That he and a teammate were apparently, according to police and the allegations, allegedly drag racing in the early morning hours of a night in January. The other vehicle crashed and the driver died and was found to have a high blood alcohol content and was found to have been driving at excessive speeds consistent, that police say, with drag racing. And they now believe that Jalen Carter had been in another vehicle, driving the other vehicle, drag racing with him, and he is wanted for charges related to the reckless driving of drag racing, etc. Jalen Carter was not at the scene where the original crash happened and the man died. He was questioned later and initially said he wasn't there. Police now believe he was there, and that's part of where these arrest warrants are coming from here. And certainly it's a bad look at the very least for Carter, who put out a statement and said, he believes that the truth will come out and he will be exonerated. I'm not going to read his full verbatim statement, but essentially that he's going to go meet with the police. He's not running away or hiding it. He's just going to say, I'm going to meet with this, confident the truth will come out and I will be exonerated from all charges. So he seems to think he'll be able to get off scot-free for any and all involvement he may or may not have had in this incident. The one thing I will say to add on to this, as far as how teams might be looking at it, is because the other driver was found to have alcohol in his system, people are naturally asking, well, did Jalen Carter also have alcohol in his system? Was he drunk driving and drag racing at that time? Carter was not, did not meet with police that night, was not around the scene, so there's no way to know with any sort of scientific certainty whether he was consuming alcohol and driving that night. But that's some of the questions that teams start to raise about this situation, about what kind of decision-making was Jalen Carter involved in, and how bad was the decision-making, right? Was this a simple mistake, kids doing a thing that's reckless that young kids sometimes do and it going horribly, tragically wrong? Or is this part of a pattern of behavior of poor decisions from Jalen Carter that might indicate, additional concerns, right? There's this idea of like character concerns and whether or not this falls under that category. And I want to give a shout out to our friend from Locked On Jaguars, Tony Wiggins, who had a great quote just in a private chat offline that he and I were involved in. And I wanted to find out the exact way that he worded it. But the idea was like the difference between a kid making a mistake and a kid having character issues, because there's a big difference. And what Tony Wiggins from Locked On Jaguars said was bad character equals bad intent. Bad choices equals poor judgment. And that's what I think is interesting to think about with someone like Carter. Did he just have poor judgment and make a poor decision to drag race behind the wheel of a car? There were reports that he had been previously pulled over for speeding earlier this fall, but everyone is pulled over for speeding sometimes. Most people have gotten a speeding ticket before in their lives. And I'm not going to say most people have drag raced at high speeds early in the morning, perhaps with alcohol involved. That's not something that you can just write off as, oh, well, everybody does that. But, some people have driven recklessly before, just in an extreme case here. So then the question is like, is this a guy who has bad intent and like legitimate character concerns about his character as a man, as a person, as a human being? Or does he have occasional poor judgment, right? Is this something that, yes, he made a mistake and can atone for that and learn from that and not make the same mistake twice? Or is this someone with poor character that has some inherent flaws about the way he views the world and the way he views himself and the way he thinks about consequences and things like that? That's the answer we won't have, but certainly the playing out of this case will go a long way in deciding it. It's important to note that these are misdemeanors and not the kind of thing that would, for example, like lead to jail time or prison time. I would think, I don't know the Georgia legal system, but I know the legal system around here, it would not necessarily, for a first offense like this and with a good lawyer and with money involved, I think he would avoid, certainly time behind bars. So how far this makes him fall, I think it definitely takes him out of the number one overall pick spot. When you're trying to differentiate between if you think Will Anderson and Jalen Carter might be kind of close as prospects, you add an arrest in the middle of the combine, well, an incident before the combine, but an arrest during combine week to one, I think it drops him a very clear step below Will Anderson when it comes to the Bears, but he's also one of the most talented defensive players in this draft. And it's not like it's loaded with defensive tackle prospects necessarily. There's other guys to like, but he's a class of his own. So, he might not fall that far down, right? This is not a guy who's going to go, for example, like undrafted because of this. Like he could still fall. He could still go top 10, top 5, even still. We'll see how this plays out, right? I think teams are still going to be wait and see how this keeps going. And if more bad things come out, he'll fall much farther than this. But if it kind of gets brushed under the rug a little bit and maybe even settles outside of court or some kind of like plea agreement type thing, maybe there's maybe it doesn't drop him very much at all. But I think when you're trying to nitpick between him or Will Anderson for the number one overall pick, this pushes Will Anderson, I think, a clear notch ahead if you're just putting those two guys head to head. I do want to get more into Will Anderson as a potential pick for the Bears at number one or elsewhere at the top of this draft. But first, the trade down and Carter playing into this role for what's going on with the Bears decide to stay at one or how far down they want to move and how Carter plays into that following this arrest warrant. That's next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook, one of the official sportsbook partners of the NFL and NBA. It's America's number one sportsbook because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. You get bonus bets back to you up to $1,000 if your first bet doesn't win. So there's no sweat. If you don't hit on your first bet, you get to go again on them. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. You can bet on who's going to be the first overall pick in this NFL draft. You can bet on who the first defensive player off the board is going to be, and you can bet it might not be Jalen Carter at this stage of the process. You could bet on which wide receiver it might be the first one taken as well. So many different ways to play across all of sports at FanDuel Sportsbook. So don't miss out on this chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL and NBA. You can see where having Jalen Carter maybe drop down your board because of the arrest might make things easier for the Bears to say, well, we don't have to make this decision at one of like, oh man, are we going to miss out on one of these two generational players? Carter has these concerns. We don't have to consider him in that tier anymore. So now it's kind of just Will Anderson. And if we're not sold on Will Anderson, then it's easier to move down and say, yeah, screw it. We'll just get another guy that we like pretty well and live with it and like all the extra draft compensation you're going to get. But you could also look at it and say, okay, now there's only really like one guy we might kind of like at number one. Maybe we're more desperate to trade down, and teams might look and say, well, hey, if you want to stay there and take Will Anderson, you can, but we don't think you're as sold on him. You don't really have those different options to pick from at the top there. So maybe we're not as desperate to get up there. Maybe you're not as desperate to move down, and we can wait and get one of these other teams that still doesn't feel like they have a shot at a blue chip player. So why not move down and get an equally good player a little bit later on in the draft? Because I think this takes away some of the Bears' leverage, but it also, you can also see where they might still have an opportunity. If they're not worried about the red flag from Jalen Carter, then they might feel like, oh, well, we could trade down and still land him later as he falls farther down boards. So I'm a little bit torn as to what kind of influence this news has on that Bears' ability to trade down, because I can kind of see things in both directions. Like, I think it will depend a lot on what else happens from here, and as a result, how much more concern there is to be about Jalen Carter. That if more information comes out about the crash and about his involvement, if there's other witness testimony, I mean, we know the criminal justice system in cases like this, and in most cases, moves very slowly, right? We're not going to have a trial in this case before draft day. We're just getting an arrest warrant for one of the people potentially involved in and around the incident. There's still months of discovery from prosecutors and defense attorneys. There's still, an arraignment there. I mean, again, I'm not an expert on the Georgia criminal justice system, but I've in a previous life, in my previous work, I've been a reporter in a lot of criminal cases and interviewed a lot of attorneys and district attorneys and defense attorneys and sat in jurors' boxes before, right? There's a long process before any of this actually gets resolved. And this may be the last nugget we get between now and draft day. Like, obviously, he's going to go to Georgia. He's going to meet with police. We may hear a little bit about that, but I don't know that we're going to get some sort of bombshell witness testimony, right? That's the kind of stuff that might come out during trial, or certainly would come out to prosecutors, but wouldn't become publicly available in exactly the same way. I mean, potentially a criminal complaint might be filed when Carter is formally charged, and that might have some additional details in it. But I think a lot of the stuff about Carter will likely be behind the scenes. NFL teams are going to dig up as much info as they can about Carter, but I don't know that that's going to become as much public knowledge to us to be able to then properly predict how teams are going to respond to an incident like this happening with Jalen Carter. And so then it's like, okay, do teams look at it and say, yeah, the Bears no longer are going to be interested in Carter at 1. So if they're not in love with Will Anderson, sorry, we'll make you stay at 1 and we can move to 3 with the Cardinals, who might be, if the Bears take Anderson at 1, then the Cardinals have nothing. If they don't want Carter because of the red flags and Anderson's off the board, then why stay at 3? You know what I mean? What's their motivation to take the best of the rest when they could trade down to 7 or 9 and still get probably the same type of player they wanted at 3 anyway? What's the hurry to get all the way to 1 unless you need to get past the Houston Texans, depending on what the Texans might do? Does it make the Texans more inclined to take a quarterback? Because maybe DeMeco Ryans was looking at these 2 top defensive prospects and making an argument in his draft room to say, hey, we have pick 12. We can wait and get a quarterback there, or even move up from 12. But at 2 is our only chance to get Anderson or Carter, whichever one the Bears don't take. well, if the Bears stay and take Anderson, then the Texans say, oh, well, screw it, we have to take a quarterback now because we don't want to use number 2 on any of these other defensive prospects. I wonder how it changes some of the math for all of these different teams, because if I'm the Bears, I feel even more inclined to want to move down now. It's not that I don't like Will Anderson by any means. He's a very talented prospect, but like there are other very good pass rushers in this draft class. And I'm not sitting here today feeling like, man, Will Anderson is just so much better than any other possible pass rusher that I can get in this draft class. He is, I think, better than the rest of the class, but how much better than the rest of the class? And can I trade down to 7 or 9 and get a different pass rusher that's still very, very, very good, maybe just not, as great as Will Anderson, but pick up so many extra draft picks? It seems to me like if I'm the Bears, because you don't even have the Carter-Anderson decision as much anymore, I'm much more inclined to move down, but then am I much more inclined to take less strong of an offer? I mean, obviously you want to get as good of an offer as you can, but if the offers are a little underwhelming, I'm still inclined to kind of take it. So that's why I wonder a little bit more if it hurts some of the Bears' trade value to move down, or does it make it easier to trade down because, oh, well, no, I'm not missing out on Carter. Anderson is the only one I have to worry about being so good that, man, I should have stayed there and picked him. If I trade down to 9, I would before I was guaranteed to miss Anderson and Carter, and you wouldn't want to look back in the future and say, man, the Bears could have stayed at 1 and got that future Hall of Famer if that's how he pans out to be. And instead they moved down to 9 and got a good player, but not as great of a player as Anderson or Carter ends up being sometime in the future. But now if you say, well, Carter had these red flags, so you understand why the Bears wouldn't take him at 1. Now there's only one other player that you look at and say, yeah, you might look back and wonder, should we have taken him? Because Carter has enough of the questions where hindsight's not going to be 20/20 there. It shouldn't be 20/20 there to say, oh, well, it turns out everything was fine with Carter and they should have taken him anyway. We don't have a lot of ways of knowing, especially when there were already murmurings before this car crash incident of some sort of character concerns, red flags, etc. I had heard at the Senior Bowl that there were times when the Georgia coaching staff was a little bit frustrated with Carter, and coaches are frustrated with players at times. It's not to say that's like a uniquely red flag to Carter, but when you're talking about number 1 overall pick, you want as squeaky clean as you can. And when there was already a few blemishes on there, and now you add this, I think it drops him out of the number 1 spot. And then from there, we'll see if a team like the Cardinals are willing to overlook that at 3, or if the Seahawks go defense at 5, if that's another potential option in the mix for Carter to still be a potential early draft pick, just maybe not quite number 1 overall. Lions at 6 could make some sense there because they could use more of an interior rusher to pair with Aiden Hutchinson. So that's kind of what I think will ultimately end up happening to Carter, is doesn't go 1 through 4, but then you get in the 5, 6, 8, 10 kind of range. One of those teams I think will ultimately probably still end up taking him. And who knows, maybe it could be the Chicago Bears after trading down. I still think if the Bears do trade down, one of these other edge rushers, not named Will Anderson, sure will be enticing for a guy like Matt Eberflus. Some other players here that really fit his scheme, and it's to the point where there are murmurs that, and I've heard at least one team has scouts that like at least one of these edge rushers more than Will Anderson, and that Will Anderson might not be the consensus, the complete consensus. Certainly the majority will think Anderson is the number 1 edge rusher prospect, but not everybody. So let's compare Will Anderson Jr. to the likes of Tyree Wilson and Lucas Van Ness and a couple others next on Locked On Bears. We're going to hear a lot about Will Anderson until the day the Bears trade away the number 1 overall pick, and that's for good reason, right? He is, I guess, essentially now, and likely will still be, the quote-unquote consensus number 1 edge rusher prospect in the draft, and really with the Jalen Carter arrest, probably the consensus number 1 defensive player and maybe number 1 total player in this NFL draft. But there are naysayers here, right? This is not a clear-cut, you got to have him, no one thinks anywhere otherwise, right? It feels a little bit more like, like with Aiden Hutchinson last year, he ended up going number 1, but there was some question as far as like, was he truly the best going into the draft? But everyone kind of settled on that by the end, and I think that's kind of where Anderson will be, despite murmurs that other teams, and I heard one scout in particular say, yeah, he has Wilson above Anderson. Doesn't mean his whole team or his GM will stack them on the board that way. But some of that is very real. Some of the mixed feelings about this. And so you wonder if some teams like Wilson better, if there's just no clear top prospect, makes it easier in our minds, I think, to trade down and feel like it's more of an even playing field. So you might as well move down, get some extra draft picks, and still get a pass rusher that might be closer to the same tier as Will Anderson. So to kind of get a sense of these prospects, right? Anderson has elite speed off the edge, right? To be able to that first step explosiveness and burst. He is quick. And then he can bend and turn the corner, right? It's those physical speed, agility, flexibility that you just can't coach, you just can't teach. You can't bring a player into the NFL and make him into that stuff. He gets Micah Parsons comparisons in that way. But he's a guy at Alabama who was so quick and bendy and explosive that he didn't really need much in terms of pass rush moves. He could just kind of beat you to the spot and go. And that's where there's the flaw there, is that like you can add pass rush moves to his repertoire because in the NFL, he's not always going to be able to speed and bend everybody. But the idea is, right, if he's already got the really uncoachable stuff, pass rush moves are the way you see players get better and improve. And if you add counter moves and additional pass rushing options to him as far as his hands, to the bend, burst, and speed that's already elite, that's how you get yourself a perennial all-pro type generational pass rusher at the top of the draft, if you can kind of add those extra tools. And at the very least, you already have a guy with speed and bend that can still win sometimes in the NFL, but is going to need pass rush moves to really fully realize his potential. But there's enough of that, like, still needs a little bit of something to fully realize his potential, that you can start to find the wiggle room for some of these other prospects to get in there, like Tyree Wilson from Texas Tech. This guy is big and long. He's like 6'5" and 275 pounds, but really agile, moves really well for an edge rusher that's that big. He is relentless. He is physical. He likes to stick his face in contact and just run in and make a big mess, right? But he doesn't always have like a great plan. He doesn't always use his hands well. He's not a refined technician. He's got like some pass rush moves in there, but it's not sharp. It's not quick. It's not something he consistently does really, really well. But he's big and he's relentless and he's long. He's got the length. Some of these other traits that aren't coachable. He's also a guy that has kicked inside and can play some defensive tackle in there too with his frame that he has on there. And so if you can kind of slow him down a little bit mentally and get like more of a pass rushing plan and know, okay, you're going to do this move and then this move instead of just throw everything at him and try and get by him in your just messy sort of jumble attack, you can have somebody there that's really, really something special with those physical tools that he has in terms of his body and the things you can't quite coach there. And it seems like Matt Eberflus likes those kind of bigger, longer defensive ends in this defense. It seems to be a decent scheme fit there. And Wilson is a guy who said he's met with the Bears a couple times already and really liked the meetings that he's had with them. There's also Miles Murphy from Clemson, another one of these powerful, big edge rushers who still moves well, but super physical, strong, gets under you. You can kind of see when he makes the punch that he can jolt offensive linemen back. He can be bigger and stronger than some of these guys, but he rushes so high with his pad level. Like he doesn't stay low and he loses leverage as a result. So like he can get the strength on, college offensive linemen, but in the NFL, you're going to need to get more of your legs involved with that and generate more of the force that way by getting under their pads and having the leverage. And there's going to need to be some development in that way. And he's a guy who came on really strong early in his college career and then hasn't really gotten like better. Like he's been good. He looked like a first round pick early on, looked like one of these guys like, oh yeah, there's a stud, there's a phenom. Watch him over the next couple of years. He's going to get really good. And he never like got really good. He just stayed very good, but he didn't like ascend. He kind of just was the same guy. So there's some questions like, okay, is he going to get better at the NFL? He's playing at Clemson. This is not group of 5 level coaching or group of 5 level of competition. He's playing against good teams on a historically good defensive line or lines that have produced NFL players before. So there's some questions there about the ability for him to get better, but clearly you take a really powerful, strong guy and you add better pad level and technique, and you can really have that translate to some major disruption on the edge in the NFL and bull rush some offensive tackles. Speaking of bull rush, Lucas Van Ness from Iowa is kind of the other one in this top tier of edge rushers who's, again, there's a lot of power in this group. Anderson's the speed guy. Wilson has some good speed too, but Murphy and Lucas Van Ness are power, physical rushers. And Van Ness has much better pad level, knows how to get low and sink really well for a guy as big as he does. But like, that's kind of all he knows how to do. Like when you watch his tape, he's going to bull rush you and drive you back to the quarterback. And he does that really, really, really well. But that's kind of it. He doesn't have go-to outside, inside moves beyond that. He just kind of rushes, just gets under your pads and moves you like a sled and then looks for the quarterback, right? And he's going to need to do a little bit more than that. It's nice that he has already a lot of the technique to do so, and he's a guy who played 3 technique defensive tackle early in his college career, then kicked outside, so he can kind of do both, and I like that versatility in the NFL. But also at Iowa, more of a rotational guy, not on the field every snap, played a lower percentage of snaps than some of these other defensive ends, just based on the rotation at Iowa and getting different guys in there and try and keep him fresh. So there's a little bit more of that, like you want to see him hold up in a full-time role and needs to be able to do more than just bull rush. But he comes into the NFL with a really refined ability to bull rush people. So he's going to have some ways to win right away, but he's going to need more ways to win as it gets going. So like all of these guys, right, have some great tools and a lot to like, but need to round out their games a little bit more. And so that leaves me feeling like it's kind of like choose your flavor of edge rusher. What type of skill set do you like the most? Which of their flaws do you think is most fixable? Because I think out of any of those 4 guys, whichever guy rounds out their game the most and fixes the most of their game is going to have the best career. Now, if they all fix all their problems, Anderson would likely be the best of them because the speed and the bend tends to be the more valuable stuff, but he still needs to add the pass rush moves, right? So it's like if Wilson or Murphy or Van Ness round out their game and Anderson doesn't, they will be the better edge rushers in the NFL. But it's a question of how well they can round out their game, how much more they can add, and how confident you are that you can add those things to their game. So it's like pick a little bit more of your fit for your team, but Anderson kind of has the most, and the most that you like, and the most that's rare, and the most to start with. But there's still a good chance that some of these other guys could end up being better pro players in the long run if they're able to develop more quickly, faster, better, and more technically sound. So I think that's why you don't have this like clear consensus 100% behind Will Anderson, but still a strong favoring of Will Anderson in that group. But it's not always as cut and dry as he's the guy and everyone else is second in line. It's like he's probably the guy that gives you the best chance for success. But there's a chance that some of these other guys could end up being just as good or better. And I'm less inclined to feel like I got to stay at 1 and get Will Anderson in the same way that now you don't got to stay at 1 and get Jalen Carter. So now it's like really a lot easier to move down from 1 and be less worried. Like it still seems like a little bit more of a crapshoot as to who the best defensive player in this draft will end up being in the NFL. Anderson, probably the best prospect right now with Carter's red flags, but how they plan out and how they look right now are 2 very separate questions. So we'll see what the combine tells us about some of these edge rushers. That can also separate some of these guys. If Anderson looks as fast as advertised, if some of these more power guys show some extra speed and a little bit more agility in the 3-cone, that can bring some of these guys up and clue you into more of their physical tools that maybe they weren't able to fully always show on the field in college. We'll break down some of the best prospects and some of the news and notes we see from the NFL Combine coming up perhaps tomorrow. If I don't know exactly when workout starts, but certainly on Monday on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. That means all of your teams across the sports. We've got a Locked On podcast for you. Plus, Locked On NFL Draft is breaking down all things NFL Scouting Combine all week long. So go check out our new hosts over there. They're doing a great job. Come on back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears. And of course, you have to come back for another opportunity to bear down.